Our Good Friday message is entitled The Sky Speaks About Easter. And we're going to be considering this topic from Mark's Gospel, chapter 15, and verse 33 to 39. Hear God's word from Mark 15, verse 33. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders, hearing it, said, Behold, he is calling Elijah. And some ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, Truly this man was the Son of God. This is God's word. Today I want to speak to you about the sky. As we go through our series of the geography of Easter, we're looking at the sky today, and we're going to consider what the sky tells us. On June the 30th, 1503, the famous Christopher Columbus beached two lost caravels and was stranded in Jamaica. The indigenous people of the island welcomed Columbus and his crew and fed them, but Columbus' sailors cheated and stole from the natives, and after 6 months the natives stopped the food supply that they were bringing to them. And Columbus had on board an almanac authored by a famous astronomer covering the years 1475 to 1506. And when he looked in that book, he noticed the date and time of an upcoming lunar eclipse. He was able to use that information to his advantage. He requested a meeting for that day with the Cacique and told Cacique that his God was angry with the local people's treatment of Columbus and his men, and that Columbus said his God is going to provide a clear sign of his displeasure by making the rising full moon appear inflamed and filled with wrath. The lunar eclipse and the red moon appeared on schedule, and the indigenous people were impressed and frightened. The son of Columbus, Ferdinand, wrote that the people with great howling and lamentation came running from every direction to the ships laden with provisions, praying to the admiral to intercede with his God on their behalf. Columbus timed the eclipse with his hourglass, and shortly before the totality ended, after 48 minutes, he told the frightened indigenous people that they were going to be forgiven. And when the moon started to reappear from the shadow of the earth, he told them that his God had pardoned them. Skip backwards 1500 years before that, and 200 years. 1500 years before that and 2000 years before today, and we land on Good Friday. We read in the text, did you notice that the sky also turned dark on Good Friday? But could that have been a coincidence? Could it have just been a well-timed eclipse that shook the people and made an otherwise ordinary death seem significant? I want us to spend some time together today thinking about the sky on Good Friday. The sky is one of those things that all of us are still able to share with one another, even though we're still in lockdown, stuck in our own homes, in our own places, but we're all sharing the exact same sky. The sky is not silent today. The psalmist says that the heavens declare the glory of God. And on Good Friday, the sky was not silent, but rather it bore testimony to what was happening on the cross. At least that's what Mark wants us to understand from his gospel. Verse 33 says, look at what it says, and when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. So let's just talk about what had happened on that Good Friday morning. So Jesus had, at this point, been hanging on the cross for 3 hours. Late the Thursday evening before, a group of soldiers had arrested Jesus, and through the night he'd gone through 7 trials until 8 a.m. in the morning. At around 9 a.m., Jesus was led through Jerusalem with a hostile crowd taunting him, spitting on him as he carries the cross through the city. Jesus then hung on the cross for 6 hours until he died. But something happened in the middle of this whole event. A darkness covered the whole land of Palestine. Darkness. Darkness can be caused by a few things. It can be caused by an eclipse. It could be caused by a sandstorm coupled with really dark clouds, but none of those are recorded in history. We know that no sandstorm or dark clouds were there at this time. There's no record of that. We also know it's not an eclipse. It's not anything like what Christopher Columbus did. This eclipse lasted for 3 hours. Eclipses of the sun, at least, at their longest are only a few minutes. But this all happened during the Passover as well, which is during the full moon, and eclipses cannot happen when there is a full moon. So this is not the same kind of thing as with Columbus. No, this darkness is different. This darkness was a failure of light. In Luke's account, it says the sun itself was darkened. The darkness was not caused by nighttime. It was noon when the sun is normally at its highest. Now there was darkness in the place of the sun. There's no gradual development either. There was no gradual coming on of the darkness. It began at the 6th hour of the day, which is 12 o'clock our time. And it went away just as suddenly at the 9th hour, which is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So it's clear that this darkness was connected with the suffering of Jesus that was happening on the cross. If you read the section just before the passage we read, if you read verse 22 to 32, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff happening. There's people, soldiers at the foot of the cross, gambling for Jesus' garments. They're putting the charges on the cross, nailing the charges against him. They're offering Jesus a drink. Passers-by are wagging their heads and mocking Jesus. Chief priests and scribes are discussing the situation with each other. And the hill outside of Jerusalem had lots of people traveling there because it was, after all, the Passover, one of the biggest feasts of the Jewish people. But here is Jesus on the cross, struggling to breathe, praying for those who crucified him, caring for the thief on the cross who had asked for forgiveness, commending his mother to John's care, and all of this business is happening around the cross, and then suddenly there's darkness. At the point of the day when the sun's at its highest, at noon, a darkness starts for 3 hours, and then there's silence. The whole world seems to come to a standstill. Now, Christ is silent. As horror hangs over him at this place, called the place of the skull, Golgotha or Calvary. No more is anyone speaking to Christ or about him, no mocking, far less discussing in business. And the people experiencing this darkness, for them it's a fearful and trembling thing to behold as they look at this awful crucifixion. So what is the sky telling us? What is this darkness all about? Well, it's not an eclipse or a sandstorm or a metaphor. It's a miracle. The laws of nature have been suspended. The sun stopped shining. No stars were shining or moon, as far as I can understand. It was an all-visible demonstration of the power of God. The one who made the sun is hanging on the cross, and the sun is no longer giving its light. Now, friends, this darkness is no coincidence. It wasn't a trick. It was there to show God's design and purpose on the cross. The purpose was judgment. The darkness proved to the whole world that God's Son was dying. The darkness was a message. It was a message about Jesus. You know, when Jesus spoke to the religious people of his day, he said he came to save them from their sins. They were offended at the idea that they needed to be saved from sins. When Jesus said that he was the Son of God, they picked up stones. They wanted to stone him. The Pharisees, they asked for a sign, and now a sign is being given from heaven. The sign was not so much the Roman technique of execution by crucifixion, that happened to a lot of people, but rather that the death is taking place in total darkness because judgment is taking place in this death. The centurion, standing nearby, understands what's going on, and in verse 39 he says, truly, this man was the Son of God. The darkness put a spotlight on the death of Jesus. It showed that it was more than just a death. This was not a good guy dying on a cross. Somebody special, somebody exceedingly different was dying on the cross. Somebody was dying who shouldn't die. Somebody is dying who should in fact live forever. And yet there he's dying not for himself. He is, if you're trusting in Jesus, he is our pardon. He is our peace. 1 Peter 3 verse 18, Peter writes and he says, for Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, that he might bring us to God, being put to death in the flesh, but made alive in the spirit. This darkness was a shroud. It was a cover over the sufferings of Jesus and his death. God was declaring through the darkness that redemption, that a buying back of people was in the death of Jesus. Isaiah the prophet, who foresaw this event centuries before, said, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. And in verse 6 of the same chapter, Isaiah said, the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. And near the end of this darkness, the sufferings of Jesus reach their unbearable climax. And Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? What was happening here? What's going on there? Well, it's described for us by Paul in a letter that he wrote to a group of Christians in Corinth. In 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21, Paul writes, for our sake, he made him to be sin who knew no sin, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. Christ bearing our sins wasn't a story, it was reality. There was an awful reality occurring that nobody could see. Christ there, suffering in the darkness, shielded from the scrutinizing eyes of people, shielded from them as he bears the suffering that only he could. But you know what this darkness does? It reminds us of another darkness. Centuries before, when the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, had repeatedly refused to allow the Israelites to go free, despite Moses pleading with him, or really admonishing him. And a series of plagues came upon the land of Egypt. There were 10 plagues, but the 9th plague, the second last one, was darkness over the whole land. And when this darkness, this inexplicable darkness covers Egypt, Moses goes to Pharaoh and says, well, you're going to let the people go now? And Pharaoh says, no, his heart is hardened. And then Moses says, very well, you're not going to see me again, and he leaves Pharaoh. And the next night, in this darkness that's still covering the land, the angel of death moves through Egypt and kills all the firstborn in the land, including Pharaoh's child. Now the children of Israel put their blood of a spotless lamb on their doorposts as per God's instruction. They remain unharmed, and it's that passing over of the angel of death because of the blood of the lamb on the doorpost that all of Israel is now traveling to Jerusalem as Jesus is being crucified. That's in fact why Jesus goes to Jerusalem. But the result of this death of the firstborn in Pharaoh's time means that he allows the Israelites to be released. He is so grief-stricken and broken. But the darkness before was a warning of what's to come, that God's judgment is going to fall on Pharaoh for his hardness of heart. It was a sign that freedom would soon come to God's people as their slavery is broken. So what is the scar telling us at Golgotha then? Well, it proves this. It proves that God has wrath, that God has anger for sinners and sin. There's no angel choirs here. There's just 3 hours of hell that Jesus goes through for the sins of his people. And there was no other way around God's character. Sin had to be punished because God's a just God and a holy God. But you know what, friends? Instead of the firstborn of a sinner dying, it was the only begotten of the Father, his own sinless firstborn Son, that he's described as the firstborn over all creation. This lamb was being slain for the sins of his people. And when Jesus was dying, he was doing so in the place of sinners. And if he didn't experience that wrath in our place, then you are still going to experience that one day for yourself, at Judgment Day. If you're not a Christian, if you don't know where you stand with the Lord, with God, with all this Jesus talk, this spiritual stuff, this darkness is a warning to you. It shows a misery that awaits a person that neglects the welfare of their souls. We look after ourselves so well. Do we neglect our souls? This darkness is a promise, though, to believers. If you're a believer, this is a promise to you that you'll never experience this, that Jesus went through that darkness to capture you, to save you, to rescue you, and transfer you to the kingdom of himself. But all Christ rejectors will perish in outer darkness, as the Bible calls hell. But Jesus is the Passover lamb. Only the sinless Son could bear the wrath of God. And just as only a spotless lamb could take the sins of others, this darkness tells you that the price for our redemption has been paid because he passed through the darkness. Do you know what Jesus said? Because he passed through the darkness, he was able to say, "It is finished." Nothing more needs to be done. Everything is accomplished on that cross. He's gone through the darkness. Gone is any need for priests or for temples or for sacrifices or for rituals. All that is needed is to hear the good news. That's what the word gospel means, is to hear the gospel preached, that sinners can come to a living God by faith. So did you notice? Do you see what brings the darkness to an end here? That cry by Jesus. It is finished, and the darkness ends. That cry wasn't a whisper as he gave up his spirit. It was a shout of victory. He went through the darkness. He endured this supernatural darkness of judgment. He made it through, and then he says, "I've done it. It's finished." And then the darkness fades. Do you know when else the darkness fades? When the gospel is preached. When you hear about Jesus dying in the place of undeserving sinners, the darkness can fade. When the finished work of Christ is preached, the darkness fades. When you hear that Jesus reigns, it's over, the darkness fades. The cosmic powers over this present darkness are forced to retreat at the preaching of the gospel. This is good news. This present darkness moves away as the gospel of a resurrected Jesus. The good news that there is an assured forgiveness for sinners and a welcome home for unworthy, undeserving sinners. The darkness can fade. What's the conclusion here? Well, Golgotha's darkness is past. That hill that Jesus died on was called Golgotha. The darkness for that hill is past. 3 hours is what it took for Jesus to handle sin. And now the gospel shines forth. Listen to how John, in one of his letters, 1 John 4 verse 8 writes. He says, "At the same time, it's a new commandment that I'm writing to you, which is true in him and in you, because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining." Jesus is the light who sits at the right hand of the Father and sends us out, Christians, as light into the world. And one day every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. The question is, friend, will you take him as Lord today? That's what the darkness is a message to you. Do you want to face outer darkness yourself one day? Do you want to live for yourself now? Do you want to live by your own righteousness, your own good works, your own deeds? Look, I'm a pretty holy person. I'm a spiritual person. I'm nice to everybody. I try and be positive. Are you going to try and do that? You are going to face supernatural darkness, the darkness of God's judgment on your own. And that little light of yours, that won't shine there. That darkness will consume it. The outer darkness of God's wrath against our sin, against our rebellion to our Maker, who made us to enjoy this world. Christian, on the one hand, this darkness should make you think more about the sin that you've been saved from and make you take your sin more seriously. It's sin that deserves outer darkness. It's sin that deserves this kind of trembling judgment. And so maybe you need to hear that today. Maybe you need to be, as a Christian, pressed upon to take your sin more seriously, not to treat it as a light thing. But let me also say this to you, that in life we go through lots of different kinds of darkness. There's a lot of history that's full of darkness. And maybe you're somebody who sometimes feels the darkness of life, the darkness of reality wanting to wrap itself around you and pull you in. Do you know what this is a promise to us of? Do you know what Good Friday tells us? Is that of all the darknesses you are ever going to face, you will never ever face this darkness of God's judgment and wrath, this supernatural, inexplicable, devastating darkness of the holiness of a God angry at sin. If you're trusting in Jesus, you'll never face that. You can know that Jesus has gone through the only kind of darkness that could ever take away all hope from you. The only kind of darkness that could leave you hopeless and utterly destroyed and utterly alone. Jesus endured that darkness for you, and at the end he said, it's finished. This darkness is no more. It's passing away. And if you embrace that and remember that when you go through all of the penultimate darknesses of life, as you're going through all of the smaller darknesses compared to that, they seem really dark when you're going through it, when it's gripping itself around you, when you see the evil of people's heart and the suffering of our friends, when that darkness wants to wrap around you, the suffering of our own children as they go through things, the suffering of dreams that are never going to be fulfilled, when those darknesses want to wrap around you, you can know this, that you're not going through those darknesses alone. That darkness you're not alone in. Because the one who endured the greatest darkness that anyone could endure is with you now by his Spirit, if you're trusting in what he did on the cross. These penultimate darknesses cannot destroy you. They cannot take away hope. There is light at the end because of what we're going to remember in a few days at the resurrection, but even today, very particularly, because it is finished. It is finished, was Jesus saying, there's going to be an end to all darknesses. All darkness is going to be destroyed, and I've dealt a decisive blow to the worst kind of darkness, so that I can be with my people in all of the darknesses they might have to face. And so, praise God for his goodness and his faithfulness to us.